Welcome, everyone. My name is Hallie Barron, and I am JCRC's Associate Director. I'm thrilled to welcome you this morning for this discussion with author Brad Kane, which is part of our Democracy Initiative. At JCRC, we believe Jews have a special interest in safeguarding our democracy because the safety of our community and other marginalized communities depends on robust democratic institutions and freedoms. Democracy Initiative was created to educate, advocate, and empower our community to engage in civic life and to protect our democratic norms and institutions. This work is more important than ever given the inequities and urgencies uncovered by the coronavirus pandemic. Brad asked me to keep his comments short, so I will point you to the JCRC website event listings to read his full bio. Brad is the author of Pitchfork Populism, 10 Political Forces That Shaped an Election and Continue to Change America. He has developed policy legislation and speeches in Congress, California state government, and the nonprofit and private sectors. Brad has spent a great deal of his life in California. In fact, we are fortunate that he was in California when JCRC kicked off our Democracy Initiative and that he has stayed in touch even after his move to the East Coast. Brad, thank you for joining us today. I'm going to turn it over to Jessica Trubowich to start the discussion.
Good morning, everyone. A few housekeeping items. This session is being recorded and may be shown again or shared by JCRC. We will have 15 minutes for Q&A at the end of this session after the discussion. If you have questions at any time, please feel free to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and write your question. I'll be reading them out loud during the Q&A session. Brad, thank you for joining us today. I'm going to turn it over to you so that you can give us some brief remarks about yourself before we begin.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate being able to join the JCRC community today. As mentioned, I was at the Waging Democracy event in 2018, so it's a pleasure to be part of that dialogue as it continues. And just as that event was fully catered, it's nice that this one is too, with, of course, whatever's in your refrigerator. I wanted to start off by mentioning a few things. First of all, of course, I wanted to explain why the title is Pitchfork Populism. It basically conjures the image of, on the one hand, it's populism, but the pitchfork part is like we saw in the Frankenstein movie, when the angry townsfolk with pitchforks and torches storm the castle, and they're angry and they're full of resentment, and they're after vigilante justice, and not necessarily all the facts, but they're against the others, which today we would call xenophobia, and people who are not like them. It's still a form of populism, but it's not what America traditionally knew to be populism. But I want to distinguish that because it's not about Democrats versus Republicans, right, left, blue, red, conservative, liberal. It's really that all Americans share a dedication to certain basic American values and principles, and our founding documents, flawed as they were, but we have a common heritage, and it's a question of, since 2016, we have seen divergence from that common heritage. And in the book, I provide an historical background in addition to the 10 forces, the mentioned 10 forces that shaped an election and continue to change America. So I deal with it from past, present, and future with an historical look and how those forces contributed to give us the outcome that we got in 2016, but then also how it's playing out every single day in our country, in our society, and in our politics and our government. And then also the implications for the post-Trump era, including solutions to how we can get to a better tomorrow. And I tried, and like one, very importantly, I'll just mention one of the 10 forces, bipartisanship. I have bipartisanship has been a theme of my career, so that's where I mentioned once again, it's about American values, traditions, norms, and our guidelines, our guideposts that we can all share in.
In your book, you have these 10 political forces that shape America, elections, and policy. Today, we're going to spend most of our time discussing what is in your first chapter, the split identity of American people between individualism and community collectivism. In order to kind of set the table for this discussion, will you provide some definitions and historical context? And I'm wondering if there's a significant reason that you put this in the very first chapter of your book.
Absolutely. Basically, we have a national split personality in our national identity. So it is absolutely intended to be, it was intentional that it was the first chapter, because it really sets a kind of a groundwork for everything else that comes after, both in the book and in American society. I really believe this is the root that has so many branches in other directions. So to describe a little bit, even before getting into rugged individualism versus communal collectivism, it's important to note their origin. How did we get here? And once again, the whole thing is not just what's going on in America today, but why. I'm very focused on the why. So why did the United States get started? It began as in objection to royalty and oppression. And people who came here from Europe, for example, were generally speaking, they wanted social mobility. They wanted opportunity. They rejected the idea of there being lords and ladies on the one hand, and then everyone else was serfs, and that was your destiny, and you couldn't find your way out of it. So they came here for social mobility. Of course, I'm referring to the Europeans who came, and that's part of the tragic original sin of the United States, is that the oppressed became oppressors in many cases by enslaving people. But nonetheless, these common themes, after you deal with the question of wanting social mobility, the question is for whom? And when you move to that next step, there are two major themes that emerge then and play out every single day in America now. Liberty on the one hand, equality on the other. It's odd that I speak of them as two separate things, because for most of us, they go hand in hand. And actually, I believe that all Americans ascribe to both. The question is, in what degree? For some people, it's here, some people, it's there. So it definitely makes a difference. And that gets into the difference between individualism and collectivism. Individualism is where people associate themselves much more so with resistance against the government, wanting to have unfettered control of their own destiny. They want small government. They don't want to be told what to do. They want to, it's very much tied in with our economic system. And with that, they want the liberty to act as individuals, and also with regard to the people who they are focused on, who they most care about, who are most within their range of vision. Collectivism, communal collectivism, is the notion that society succeeds when every person in society succeeds. If you only have individuals, and that certain individuals succeeds while other individuals basically are tamped down, that ultimately comes back to with negative consequences for all of America, because then there's social friction and there's movements to be able to level the playing field. So really, communal collectivism is one of caring for people beyond themselves, beyond their network, for a broader universe of people. And with regard to that, that's when we get into the certain key our founding documents and certain guideposts that are very important, that inculcate these things, and once again that were flawed, in which constitutional amendments have sought to revise. A little footnote there, as I put in the book, if Thomas Jefferson had a do-over, I think there would be a number of things, if he were writing it today, obviously that would be very different. But one word in particular that we all keep quoting, all men are created equal. How hard would it have been to say all people? So right there, you cut out 50% of the population right there. And then, of course, treating African Americans as a fraction and basically ignoring indigenous people. But nonetheless, those two tracks of individualism and collectivism are the two deep-seated notions. And if I can just add something to that, how it plays out today. Those two camps, and getting to your question of why it's chapter 1, they play out in so many other things that have branched out from there. There's, of course, Democrat versus Republican, but there's also isolationism versus interventionism. There is capitalism with very much on the individualist side, where the one that has the liberty to aggregate wealth as they wish and choose, and without, not wanting regulation from the state, versus the social safety net, which is absolutely as American as anything else now. And that's one of those things like what we've seen in recent years when people were objecting to Obamacare, but saying, don't touch my Medicare. What? So they were objecting to government health care, but saying, do not even think about messing with my government health care. But it also plays out in terms of small government versus big government, and big business versus labor, and many branches that extend from there.
I'm wondering, you mentioned political parties. Is individualism and communalism just another way of talking about Republicans and Democrats at this point? Or are there differences where you see maybe some Democrats, have some individualism, and vice versa? I mean, is it split the same way?
What matters more are the characteristics and the underlying values. So, for example, basically, I would say no. One of the things that's very notable now is that so many Republicans have left the Republican Party. It's absolutely amazing how President George W. Bush's senior staff have been some of the most vocal critics about what's going on right now. And some of the, like Steve Schmidt, together with George Conway, created the Lincoln Project. And basically, people with bedrock Republican values who object to the divergence from those values. The Wall Street Journal today had an editorial talking about the current occupant of the White House debasing his office. That was the Wall Street Journal saying that. So it's not just a question of Democrat versus Republican. It's really about underlying values and principles. And there is some correlation. One of the interesting things about your question is it also raises the issue of the kind of the tribal notion of political parties. That there are some people who, I'm a this, I'm a that, and they don't really want to question what's underlying it. What are they supporting? That's where I believe the more education that you have, the more awareness you have among the people, among the electorate, the better off we all are for being able to understand what the underlying forces are that you're being basically fed.
So during these last months of the stay-at-home order, it looks like we're seeing a clash between these philosophies play out very publicly, whether it's at the beach or it's the response from local, state, and especially the federal government. Does this surprise you? Would you have thought that an event like a pandemic would have brought these philosophies together in some way?
Well, it's interesting that in March, when suddenly everyone realized, oh my gosh, this is for real, you saw broad-based participation. But then once Donald Trump started talking about opening up the opening up the economy by Easter, everyone should, fill the churches on Easter, the first or second weekend in April. Then people started, that gave people license to question the dictates from the CDC and Dr. Fauci and others. Very problematic. So, and then we started seeing these protests. The first one I remember was in Michigan, and since then it's flourished in many different places. And the interesting thing is that some of those protests also are funded by certain political organizations that are either Trump supporter or Betsy DeVos's family, people like that. So the interesting thing about that, the tragic thing about that, is that the people who are out there objecting to government control, and we've seen some amazing testimonials and interviews over the weekend, they are hurting themselves. They are hurting their own interests. When Donald Trump throws cold water on the idea of wearing a mask, partly because he doesn't wear a mask, except for behind closed doors, perhaps. But by him doing that, he's basically impairing the interests of his own constituency. The people who listen to him the most are now the most at risk, which also shows where his allegiances lie. But it's tragic, because it is absolutely something that, just to back up and just say the obvious, initially we thought we needed to wear masks and keep social distancing for the sake of other people. Because any of us who care, and this gets back to the difference between individualism and collectivism in terms of the scope of people you care about. Do you just care about yourself? Do you care about your family, your city, your community, your state, the country, depending on how big you draw your circle of concern? Initially, we thought we were supposed to wear masks and keep social distance to protect people who are the most vulnerable, the elderly and people with underlying conditions. As we've been seeing in the last couple of months, that's not the case. We've been seeing reports of 25-year-olds dying, and just this morning I saw a report of an 18-year-old high school senior who passed away just yesterday. It's amazing. It's tragic. And so when these people are out on the beach saying he doesn't wear a mask, so I'm not going to wear a mask, and I'm paraphrasing, but that's exactly what someone was interviewed saying over the weekend. It is impairing the people that he putatively cares about.
In all of this, it seems like there's a real focus on houses of worship as kind of a battleground. And I'm wondering why you think that could be.
First of all, it's all politics. It's numbers. It's very interesting. Donald Trump knows where let me back up. Got to give him credit in 2016 for having identified a slice of the population that felt alienated, discarded. They felt that neither Democrats nor Republicans had their back. They still hadn't recovered from the economic crisis of years before. And Donald Trump aptly recognized them, and he basically, in addition to legitimizing it, and of course he exacerbated their angers and fears and grievance mentality, but he organized them into a bloc. And evangelicals were one of the core constituencies. The interesting thing, one of the things I found to be perhaps most revealing of both Donald Trump's view of his base, but also about this major trend that's going on in the country, including pitchfork populism, is that in February 2016, when Donald Trump won the Nevada primary, that night he made a speech where he was thanking different people, and he said he thanked a whole bunch of different groups, but he used the word love for two groups. One was, I love the evangelicals, and the other he says, and this is a direct quote, I love the poorly educated, which to me speaks volumes about his mindset and who he believes he's speaking to. So unfortunately, that gets into what if the evangelicals are willing to give him votes by him putting certain judges in place, by him taking very hardline positions. It's a complete contradiction of terms. It's a complete clash of values. It's something that's very difficult to understand, that evangelicals who stand up for certain principles very strongly and would with anyone else, because they're being given the benefits that they've been salivating for a long time, they are basically giving him a pass with all his sexual improprieties and all that. They turn and look the other way because he's giving them the goodies. And personally, I think COVID-19 could damage that, because as he's putting forth the message that he's putting forth, when they start seeing deaths in the church community, and in particular, if he's telling people, go back to church, and then 2-3 weeks later, there's an outbreak of people who are in that church, and 3 or 5 or whatever number of people pay the ultimate price, that will be noticed.
Yeah. And so I'm wondering, do you think the coronavirus, COVID-19, will possibly move and change people's philosophies so that people may be moving from individualism to collectivism, or vice versa?
I think you're hitting the nail on the head, Jessica. The whole thing about COVID-19 completely defies individualism. It is entirely, the solution is entirely about collectivism. The way that, first of all, when we're talking about flattening the curve and stopping the spread, that doesn't happen on an individual basis. That only happens by everyone in the community doing the right thing, everything from wearing masks to keeping socially distant, and everyone's got to participate that. When you go into the supermarket, I know I look around, I'm noticing, are people wearing masks, and I'll avoid certain people if they're not. Mm-hmm. It's really about all of us doing the right thing, and that's changing our mindset. So when, for example, Donald Trump, of course, basically took no action in February. Okay, he's going to say, on the end of January, I shut down travel from China. We know he's inclined. We've seen in the past how he shuts down travel from certain other places. He didn't shut down travel from Europe, and that the European travelers are who infected the whole New York, New Jersey area where we saw the epicenter for American deaths. And on top of that, one thing he did, there were all the other times when basically he took an individualist approach, wanting to focus on his stock market and his economy, saying that it'll all go away, it'll be a miracle, all that kind of stuff. And then here's one of the things I found especially amazing, is that at one point, I'm not exactly sure, I think it was late March, he said, "My authority is total," which is just like I alone can fix it, and I'm the one who matters. These are direct quotes of other things he said. But when he said, "My authority is total," he was basically making it sound as though the solution to COVID-19 is individualism, with him as the ultimate individual. Mm-hmm. I think his staff probably made him realize right after that if he does that, then he's putting on his shoulders all the blame for everything that's happening in COVID, which is why just days later he came out and said from the presidential podium, "I don't take any responsibility at all." How's that for a shift according to what serves his interests? But that is also emblematic of individualism versus collectivism. Once there's a recognition that every person must do their part, and that starts getting in people's thoughts, then when it comes down, as we watch this continue throughout this year, and there will be more outbreaks of COVID in specific places, and when we start seeing that places where people are very respectful of each other and are taking all the right precautions, there are not outbreaks. And in places where people are like, oh my gosh, the video we saw of Lake of the Ozarks this past weekend, that was absolutely amazing. If there's an outbreak that follows that, people are going to start understanding, we do need a collective, a communal response. And that mentality is going to continue. And I believe not through all the population, but there are a lot of people who are going to start seeing things that way. And when we get to November 3rd, they're going to be thinking a lot more along the lines of we are one country. And let me also add into that, the racial disparity, a racial and ethnic disparity of both infections and deaths is outrageous. And part of that has to do with the economies. Who is driving our public transportation? Who is working in the grocery store? And most extremely of all, and with heartfelt appreciation, who's working in our hospitals? And when you see the divergence of society, some people are lucky enough to stay at home, some people are not. But when you see that and people start realizing it and start caring more, that empathy will start working its way into being an important theme about what's going on in this country leading up to Election Day.
And that was the perfect segue to my next question, because I know you have had concerns about November 2020 before COVID-19, and now I'm interested to learn what those concerns were and what's been added to those concerns since COVID-19.
Well, first of all, even before COVID-19, the whole question is America, let me back up. In 2016, people didn't know what Donald Trump would be like. I used to get very frustrated listening to commentators and journalists saying, well, sure, he said that, but now he's going to pivot. Or then after he did something outrageous, then he would read something that someone prepared for him and they said, oh, he's pivoting. No, he's not. You know, sometimes people would weigh on him to do something. They were interpreting things from the point of view of what they would do if they were in that position, not what he would do. So basically, what we've seen is that he has, as I put forth in the book, page 99, in case anyone's interested, on page 99 and 100, I lay out the 5 driving forces that propel Donald Trump's actions, decisions, comments. And basically, the bottom line from all that is that unlike any president, Democrat, Republican, that we've ever had before, his focus is on his own interests. And that leads to unilateralism. He does things, he constantly contradicts himself. Not just like, for example, with COVID, where I was just saying my authority is total to I don't take any responsibility at all. But on gun rights, he said he accused Republicans of being scared of the NRA and that he was going to do something. He told that to Senator Dianne Feinstein. And then just a day or two later, he completely shifted because it was not in his best interest. When it came to the government shutdown in 2018, 2019, he at first told Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senator Schumer that he would take full responsibility. And of course, as soon as we hit January and the government was closed, he was accusing the Democrats of all sorts of things. So it's these flip-flops, and there's, Lord knows, there's so many of them I can't keep track. But that's because he analyzes things in terms of his own interests. He contradicted himself on healthcare in 2017 when the Republicans were passing something in the House. So the whole thing from that is that what is America willing to accept? What is America willing to tolerate? So Republicans, I believe, were willing to give him a chance because they didn't know what he'd be about, and there were a number of reasons why people voted for Donald Trump in 2016. In some cases, they liked him. In some cases, there is a strong racist element, something I mentioned in the book. It's an insult, and it's wrong to say that all Trump voters are racist. That's completely false and wrong. It's also false, wrong, and offensive to say that there aren't completely racist people among the Trump supporters. We see it. We know it. So, I don't know exactly what the fraction is, but that's a very prevalent stream. So the difference between 2016 and 2020 is in 2016, it was like a green screen, like the weatherman. You could project any image of Donald Trump of what you thought he was going to be like. And so some people voted for him thinking, well, they don't like the opponent and this reason or that reason. No one in America in 2020 can claim that they don't know what Donald Trump is about anymore. No one. But you may love him, you may feel exactly the opposite about him, but no one can claim that they don't know. So the whole thing is, are there reasons, if you voted for Donald Trump in 2016, are there reasons why you are second guessing that? And okay, you blew off steam. Now I'm going to vote for a better America with another candidate. That's one side. How about people who voted for Hillary Clinton? I can't think of a single reason why anyone who did vote for Hillary Clinton before would now switch in 2020 and vote for Donald Trump. So the voter shifts that I described in chapter 10 are stacked against them. And by no means is it a foregone conclusion, because the Democratic side needs to do all the right things, and it starts with voter registration, messaging, and everything else. But the shifts in terms of what we've seen and the mentalities and Republicans who are offended by different comments and different assaults on different people, that's all really now part of the decision-making process.
Staying on the topic of elections, we're fortunate in California to have a governor that made an executive order that every voter will receive a mail-in ballot. Do you believe that other states will be able to have fair, free, and safe elections in November 2020. Where are you most concerned? What type of national protections do you think need to be put in place?
There are a lot of elements to that. First of all, there's the question of funding for the post office, which of course Speaker Pelosi is going to bat for in the next, included in the bill that just passed the House, which of course is now, being renegotiated. But that's a very important thing, so that the post office has funding to be able to do that. But there's also the question of state laws, state by state, to allow that. And there's a fascinating distinction between some states, like for example, Ohio, with Republican Governor Michael DeWine. He recognizes the problems. He doesn't want to put his people at risk. And there are other Republican governors also. It's not a Democrat-Republican thing. It's a question of who cares about being able to enable everyone to vote and vote safely without putting people in jeopardy. You don't want to have to make someone choose between voting and living if they're putting themselves at risk. So part of it is state laws, part of it is federal funding, but the other part that's so important is election security. We know that Russia and other countries are already trying to weave their way into our electoral systems. In some cases, they're trying to hack into systems. In other cases, they're just trying to poison our dialogue and our debate by putting false memes and false things on Facebook and Twitter and everywhere else. And we hear about the bots that they're using. So that's a big issue too. And the intelligence community knows about it. The question is, are the Republicans in the Senate especially going to take it upon themselves to act in the way that they know that they should, because they see, once again, it's the intelligence community that's telling us this is in fact happening. So it's a three-pronged part. My guess is there will be a negotiated agreement where they meet in the middle. I do think there will be more funding for the post office. It'll be left up to states individually. Utah, for example, mostly Republican, they are 100% mail-in ballots. So it'll be a state-by-state choice. But the big issue is whether or not the federal government, because the federal government has a unique role when it comes to election security. That's the big concern I have in terms of, they did have a little bit of money in December, but only a little. The question is, how robust will our protections be to make sure that Americans are influencing the American election?
So we're going to wrap up our section and move to Q&A in just a few minutes, but I wanted to ask you, do you think the experience of the pandemic and the government response will have a lasting effect on our democracy and our democratic institutions, and what do you think that will be?
Some prognostication is required. Absolutely. So the easy answer is yes. A lot of people are being awakened to sensibilities that they may not have had before. Certain, once again, it's caring about, broadening their scope of concern. As I talk about concentric circles, now that we're seeing, the hospital workers and what they're doing and what they're going through, there are a lot of people. Americans are by nature also, I believe, a caring people. For the most part, we have empathy. Most people, even on the individualism side, there's a question, maybe a degree, but I was about to go on a tangent about empathy. Is the lack of empathy we've seen, and we know of a lot of examples. Yes, I do think there will be a lasting effect. I think people are going to be reaching out more. I haven't seen recent numbers in terms of like how many people are donating and what amount of money to different organizations, either for food or for housing or helping certain people. But the fact also that our federal government, with Nancy Pelosi in the lead, has done such an amazing job, magnificent job in passing different things to support, especially now the frontline workers, the HEROES Act. That's hugely important. One of the things that we don't know is that with the stay-at-home order, a lot of people are learning new habits. A lot of people feel constrained, but there's also a certain reaching out that's happening now that's expanding people's circles. Here we are on this Zoom discussion. And I think these kind of things will continue, because as beautiful as it is to have JCRC's Waging Democracy, where everyone's in a room, that can still, at a certain point, we'll be able to do that again. But it may be appropriate also to connect, for example, with the JCRCs nationwide and have a nationwide day of discussion about democracy. And that's something that we didn't even think about before. And now we all have the tools at our fingertips to be able to do these things. And that extends our reach, extends our concern, extends our empathy, extends our caring, finds new alliances, new partners, and be able to amplify our voices and our caring.
So I've heard you talk about a pendulum swing throughout history between the communalism philosophy and individualism. Where do you think we are now? And is there a way to bring the pendulum to the middle? Is that where we want it to be, in that safe space there? What are your thoughts?
The United States has a long history of the pendulum swinging. We've seen that in even with regard to populism per se. So one easy example is in the late 1800s, after the Civil War, there was this period of presidents, some Democrats, some Republican, but it was a very weak presidency. They didn't want to do much. And basically that was the era of the robber barons and the Gilded Age and laissez-faire, where people could just go out and people were encouraged to, be industrialists and create. And basically that also meant pillaging people who were voiceless. And that's when all the abuses started happening, whether it be in sweatshops and that a lot of our families, our ancestors experienced and things like that. And then the populism movement rose from that. You had the writings of Henry George. You had Mary Elizabeth Lease in Kansas with the People's Party. You had Coxey's Army marching from Ohio to Washington, D.C. All these were kind of things where the people started to say enough of this. And that's what then empowered William Jennings Bryan to come to the fore. And of course, the 1896 election was transformational because, that was a head-to-head. McKinley was saying, I'm a tariff man. And making all kinds of comments about the gold standard, which supported people who were already the most wealthy, and just everything he did, which was for big business. And you had William Jennings Bryan, who was the exact opposite. The fascinating thing is that then because of all those years of negating the people, that's when Teddy Roosevelt became president from McKinley being shot. He brought in an entirely different attitude. He's actually a really unique character because he combines both individualism and communalism in his own personal way. But he brought in a set of policies that were completely separate and apart from what had happened in the preceding 30 years. And then, of course, then you see Taft went kind of back to the old school. Wilson took it in a new direction. Then in the 20s, the three Republicans who were there as examples of the individualism, and I refer in the book to anything and everything that Calvin Coolidge ever thought or did. And then from there you get FDR. These are natural pendulum swings, and sometimes there's it's not as extreme as other times, but in our recent past, going from Bill Clinton to George W. Bush, to Barack Obama, to Donald Trump, that speaks loudly of the pendulum swing. And it's in large part, it's that people experience what a particular governing style was like, what it's about, where it left them, how it affected them and impacted them. And often it's a rejection of that and saying, I want to try something different. Not always. George H.W. Bush, number 41, won an election after 8 years of Reagan. So in that case, it wasn't. But for the most part, there tends to be a pendulum swing, though not entirely and not always.
So I'm going to move now to the Q&A from our audience here. And first, I'm going to read out loud the questions that we have in the Q&A section. And then if we have time and there are people who want to ask a verbal question, you can hit the raise your hand button and we'll call on you one at a time. So the first question we have is, This dichotomy between individualism, small government versus communalism, federalism appears to have existed from the beginning of the Republic. However, the tensions seem to erupt infrequently. Why is that, and why is it happening now?
Well, actually, it's an interesting word you use when you use the word erupt, because I believe that those tensions are always there. But I also agree with you about the use of the word erupt. So, for example, in 1940, after 8 years of Franklin Roosevelt in the presidency, there was a very strong movement about America First. And Wendell Willkie was running on the basis of a pendulum swing and basically taking that tension, feeling like government had gotten too big. And of course, you could make an argument for that in some cases, because of course, Franklin Roosevelt at one point threatened to try to stack the court, and that is contrary to our heritage also. So Wendell Willkie was basically trying to bring that sentiment to the fore. Ultimately, in that case, the Americans did not accept that, weren't ready for that, didn't feel like that was the appropriate way to go. But those tensions, I believe, are often dormant. It's a question of what sparks that concern, what inflames people. We saw what happened with the Tea Party in, I think, 2010. When the Tea Party started up, it was like, and that of course is part of what led to the 2016 election too. But the Tea Party creation, there had been people who had certain set of feelings and beliefs about what was going on in America at the time. But then once that was like the spark, and that whole movement got activated. So it's almost as if there's a bit of a snowball effect. Once people find a community for them to hitch their wagons to, that catalyzes a movement, adds fuel to the fire. But I don't believe it goes on that way inexorably. I believe at a certain point, it runs its course, it burns itself out a little bit, people become disenchanted. So the bit about an eruption, I agree, but I don't believe that the eruption necessarily has to lead to, the ultimate conflagration and, dystopia. Well, actually, I guess one could argue we're there already on dystopia, but as far as a wholesale conflagration, it doesn't need to go to that extent. A very interesting example that I think ties in with this is in late 2008, when George W. Bush was approached by Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson with the situation with the banks. It was reported that he said, if something, I'm paraphrasing here, something to the effect of, if it's as bleak as you say it is, you can be damn well sure I'm going to be Roosevelt and not Hoover. So in that case, he recognized the perils of, if he were to stick to his ideology, that it might have caused an eruption. And he, in that case, was willing to depart from his usual orientation on big government because he didn't want to be labeled the next Hoover and cause an eruption.
Okay, thanks. So here's our next question. You could arrive at the decision to wear a mask from either an individualist or a communal perspective. Isn't the no mask position more a matter of anti-science, anti-intellectualism, compounded by a faux definition of liberty, than the split between individualism and communalism?
Yes.
Simply yes.
Yes, too. Science, fact, truth is absolutely the core of what's going on, of how we need to respond in the case of COVID-19. In my opinion, it should be the core of everything. We should have data and do things according to logic and things like that. But I realize that on some issues, people can argue things in multiple ways. But with regard to what you're saying here, the virus doesn't read tweets and doesn't care about whether we want to go to the beach. It's going to do what it's going to do. So I couldn't agree with you more that science and data and facts are at the core of it. The reason I add into that the overlay of individualism versus collectivism it's a question. The thing that's so perplexing is, why aren't people listening to the science and the scientists and the data and the facts? And that's where going to the why and trying to dig below that and say, well, why aren't these people taken care of even just for their own sake? And that's where I believe it's this notion of, for some people, this individualistic attitude. I don't, keep the government out of my business and things like that. There's often, for some people, there's kind of a knee-jerk response when the government says, this is the way things are. They don't want to be told this is the way things are, and they have that kind of a response. And by no means am I speaking, overly broadly to like saying everyone is like that. But when the quotes that I've seen from people on the beach and at events over this weekend, they sure echoed that.
I think everyone's along the same train of thought right now. So the next question is, what can be done about the spread of misinformation and disinformation? For instance, a recent poll said approximately 50% of Fox News viewers believe that Bill Gates is behind the COVID-19 in order to inject microchips into Americans via a vaccine.
I honor that question in a big way. Chapter 5 of my book is titled Media and the Battle for Truth and Facts. And I believe that's a multi-pronged issue and a problem. Our media landscape, I put it in terms of the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that because of social media and the internet, there's a lower barrier for entry. Anyone can be putting forth views and information. That's actually a good thing in terms of freedom of expression. The bad is that we no longer have a common set of facts and a curator, the way Walter Cronkite was. When he spoke, we all took note. And of course, his famous tagline at the end, that's the way it is. He didn't care about adjusting his facts according to people's sensibilities. He told you that's the way it is. The ugly is when people, because of this Wild West attitude in social media, where some people, unfortunately, are using that as an opportunity to manipulate messages, to manipulate minds, manipulate the minds of the malleable, really. And some people reject that. Some people spot it and reject it, but other people accept it. And one of the troubling things I find about that is that, unlike the Walter Cronkite days, it's really one of the key things now is about having a relationship with the audience. And that's not something that Cronkite cared about, but now that's what's happening. There's some media that goes right to, here's what the facts are, here's what the science says, without feeling like they need to connect with their audience. There are other media, and we know which ones, that are all about connecting with their audience, and they don't care about the science. They just want to connect. Personally, I think part of the solution for those who want to put forth science and data and facts in the media is to also have a relationship with the audience where the audience wants to hear from them. But there are a number of other things. Also, I distinguish in the book between social media versus mainstream, like broadcast. In social media, there are a number of things that should be done for posts. For example, if something's from an international source, it must declare that. There must be disclosure. If there is something from an international source, there should be an American source to go with it. There are a number of things like that in social media that I described on the mainstream side in terms of broadcast. The use of the chyron at the bottom of the screen. Audience warning, falsehood in progress. I think more of that is necessary, so that when someone is speaking from a podium and they're saying something that is completely unsubstantiated, in real time, not waiting for afterward to critique it, but in real time, so that someone watching that can see, I'm being lied to right now. So yes, there are some ways to deal with that, and I put some of those solutions forth.
So the next question says, is there something about conservative values that tells Republicans they must not publicly disagree with their president, particularly a Republican president? If so, what is making them finally begin to do so now?
Fantastic question. I don't know if it's about being conservative, or I really think it goes back to it's a combination maybe of that and the individualism, conservatism dichotomy. So with individualism, one of the things about individualism is that it celebrates the individual. And therefore, it's even more inclined to find a champion, a hero, looking for the ultimate individual. So there are some that we celebrate. Lewis and Clark were great individualists. And we can all celebrate them because we know what their achievements were. Thomas Edison was a great individualist. We appreciate all of his inventions. But one of the things about individualism is that when they want to often kind of anoint someone and discharge onto them responsibility for some of their own decision making, because they are, as individualists, they are looking for someone who's a bigger individualist. And that is part of how Donald Trump gets away with that, because within a particular segment of the population, they are willing to embrace that. They are looking for something like that. So on the other side, communalists aren't interested in that. We'll choose a leader, but the way that leader speaks to us is the key word of populism. Like when in 2008, the candidate Barack Obama adopted the parlance of you. That the word where normally you'd see I, he was always using the word you. And so sure, we obviously there's going to be some leader no matter what, even William Jennings Bryan, as I mentioned, but it's a question of empowering the individuals. I'd also I want to cite something that I cited in my book. For the person who asked that question, I think you'd find it very interesting to read an article, March 3rd, 2016, March 3rd, 2016 in Vox.com, called The Rise of Authoritarianism. It describes this, and it talks about paternalism, and it really delves into some of the underlying emotional and psychological forces that lead people to do what you were asking about.
So we only have a few minutes left. So we do have an interesting final question here. It's about Howard Stern, so I hope it's appropriate for our broadcast here. But it says, what is your take on Howard Stern's recent comments about Trump?
My apologies, I'm not following Howard Stern, so I don't know what he said.
Okay, and unfortunately, me either. So, it's 3 minutes before 12 o'clock. We have wrapped up the current
Can I actually answer that with a replacement answer?
Sure.
Not knowing what Howard Stern said, but knowing what some other people have said recently. As I mentioned before about the Wall Street Journal, saying that he's debasing his office. But for example, the Lincoln Project that has taken great exception to his authoritarianism. There are others, like one of the things that is so troubling that we're seeing right now is the firing of inspectors general. Part of authoritarianism and unilateralism is that Donald Trump despises accountability because that is his kryptonite. That basically is guardrails where he wants none. So the recent firings at Department of Defense, Department of State, the intelligence communities, HHS, and I'm leaving one out. Transportation. It's so offensive to fire the people who have the responsibility for accountability. And on top of that, here's something that's underreported, is that the DOD IG that was fired was replaced by an acting AG, who is acting Inspector General, who is actually the current Inspector General at the EPA. What does that mean? It means not only is this not appropriate for DOD, but he's surcharging this person, which basically does a broadside to accountability of the EPA, which comes at roughly the same time as Donald Trump's executive order saying that environmental regulations will stop and will stop being enforced. So it's all part of this same stew of malfeasance, which I really believe is inseminating the body politic. And getting back to your earlier question, I think it's going to continue to become more prevalent, more attention to it, with an impact in November.
I think we could have a whole other conversation about government accountability. It's something we should all be watching. And so I thank you for those comments.
Howard Stern said something exactly along those lines.
So before we sign off, first of all, if anyone has further questions, Brad is happy to stay on. Thank you, Brad, for that. Just a few quick reminders. If you haven't filled out your census, folks, it's time. Please remember to register to vote. And lastly, in a few weeks, we'll be having a discussion with Assemblymember Mark Berman about fair and safe elections in November 2020. So please be on the lookout for that information. Brad, thank you so much. This has been a very interesting conversation. We really appreciate your time. And thank you everyone else for being here.
Thank you very much. It's obviously a great pleasure and honor to be with the JCRC community. And I appreciate your questions and everyone else, the questions of everyone who asked them from the community.